The knife was already at her throat before Alira understood what was happening. She had been carrying a tray of bread and warm broth down the narrow stone hallway of the palace kitchens, when a hand grabbed her from behind and pulled her into the shadows near the servant stairs. The tray fell. The bowl shattered. Someone hissed at her to stay quiet, and for a moment, Alira thought her life was going to end in a dark corner of a palace, where nobody would even notice she was gone. "Where is the seal?" the man whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "The king keeps a red seal in his private chamber. You clean that room. You know where it is." Alira's heart pounded so hard she thought it might break through her chest. She had cleaned the king's chamber exactly twice in 3 months, and both times she had barely dared to look at anything beyond the dust she was told to sweep. She did not know about any seal. She did not know this man. She only knew that his blade was pressed just hard enough against her skin to draw the smallest line of warning. "I don't know what you are talking about," she said, her voice shaking. "Please, I am only a servant. I carry food. I clean floors. That is all I do." The man did not believe her. His grip tightened on her arm, and Alira felt the cold stone wall against her back, felt the broth soaking into her sleeve, felt every second stretch longer than it should. Footsteps echoed somewhere down the hall, growing louder, and the man cursed under his breath. "If you tell anyone," he said, "you will not live to regret it." Then he was gone, slipping through a side door that led to the old servant passage, leaving Alira alone in the dark, with her heart still trying to climb out of her throat. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold floor, staring at the shattered bowl and the spilled broth soaking into the stone, and for a long moment she simply could not move. It took her nearly a full minute to remember how to breathe properly. Alira Voss had grown up believing that the safest thing a person could be was invisible. She had lived her whole life by that rule. Keep your head down. Do your work. Do not draw attention. Her family had fallen into debt 3 years ago, when her father's small trading business collapsed after a failed deal with a merchant from the Eastern Territories. To pay what they owed, Alira had been sent to work in the palace of the Blackthorn Pack, serving in the kitchens under the watchful eye of the head cook, a stern woman named Marta who believed that servants should be seen only long enough to complete their tasks. For 2 years, Alira had followed that rule perfectly. She swept floors, she carried trays, she scrubbed pots until her hands were raw and red. She spoke only when spoken to, and even then, as little as possible. She had told herself, over and over, that this quiet life was enough, that surviving was enough, that she did not need anything more than a roof over her head and enough food to keep her family from starving. But standing in that dark hallway, feeling the last traces of fear crawling up her spine, Alira understood something new. Being invisible had not protected her. Someone had noticed her enough to grab her, to threaten her, to demand something from her that she did not have. Invisibility was a lie she had told herself to feel safe, and the lie had just been shattered, along with the bowl of broth at her feet. She forced herself to stand. Her legs were unsteady, but she managed it, smoothing down her apron with trembling hands, and glancing down the hallway in both directions. No one was there. Whoever had grabbed her was gone, vanished into the maze of servant corridors that ran beneath the palace like veins beneath skin. She should report this. She knew she should. But reporting it meant explaining why a stranger believed she had access to the king's private chamber, and explaining that meant drawing attention to herself in a way she had spent 2 years trying to avoid. Still shaking, she picked up the broken pieces of the bowl and gathered them into her apron, deciding she would clean the mess before anyone noticed, and asked questions she did not want to answer. She moved quickly, quietly, the way she always did, slipping back toward the kitchen with her head down. She did not make it. "You are bleeding." The voice was low, controlled, and utterly unfamiliar in its calm. Alira froze mid-step, and when she looked up, her stomach dropped straight through the stone floor beneath her feet. Cale Ashgrove stood at the end of the hallway, tall and still, dressed in the dark, unadorned clothing he preferred over the ceremonial robes his position demanded. He was not surrounded by guards, which was unusual, and his sharp gray eyes were fixed directly on her, missing nothing. Alira had seen the Alpha King from a distance perhaps a dozen times in 2 years, always across a room, always surrounded by advisors and warriors, always untouchable. She had never once been close enough to see the color of his eyes. Now she was close enough to see that they were the color of storm clouds, and they were looking straight at the thin line of red at her throat. "Your Majesty." Her voice came out smaller than she intended, and she dropped into a hurried bow, broken pottery still clutched in her apron, broth staining her sleeve. "Forgive me, I did not hear you approach." "You are bleeding," he said again, as though she had not understood him the first time. He took a step closer, and every instinct in Alira's body screamed at her to step back, to look away, to make herself as small and unremarkable as possible. She stayed still instead, because moving felt more dangerous than staying frozen in place. "It is nothing, Your Majesty. A small accident." I dropped a tray. His gaze moved from the thin cut on her throat to the broken bowl in her apron, to the fear that she knew must still be written plainly across her face, no matter how hard she tried to hide it. Cale Ashgrove had not survived as Alpha King for as long as he had by missing details. Alira understood this even in her panic. She understood that whatever story she gave him, he would examine it, the way a jeweler examines a stone, searching for the flaw hidden beneath the surface. "A tray," he repeated, "does not leave a cut like that." Alira said nothing. She did not know what to say. Admitting the truth meant admitting that a stranger had grabbed her in his palace, demanding something about a seal she knew nothing about, and something told her that admitting this to the king would open a door she was not prepared to walk through. "I fell against the corner of the shelf," she said finally, the lie sitting awkwardly on her tongue. "I was clumsy. I apologize for the mess. I will clean it immediately." For a long moment, Cale simply studied her, and Alira felt that gaze like a physical weight pressing against her skin. She had expected him to dismiss her, to wave her away with the same indifference he showed to every servant who crossed his path. Instead, he continued looking at her, as though she were a puzzle he had not yet decided whether to solve. "What is your name?" The question caught her entirely off guard. In 2 years, no one above the rank of head cook had ever asked for her name. "Elira, Your Majesty. Elira Voss." "Elira Voss," he said, testing the name in his mouth as though weighing its shape. "You work in the kitchens." "Yes, Your Majesty." "And yet you carry a tray meant for my private chamber." His eyes flicked toward the direction she had come from, and Alira realized, with a fresh wave of dread, that he already knew exactly where she had been headed before the attack. "That is not a kitchen assignment. That is a personal one." "There was a shortage of hands this evening," she said quickly. "I was asked to help with the delivery, that is all." Cale did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached out, and for one terrifying heartbeat, Alira thought he meant to touch the cut on her throat. He did not. He stopped just short of it, his hand hovering in the space between them, and something in his expression shifted, just slightly, into something she could not name. Concern, perhaps, or curiosity, or both. "Have the healer look at that," he said finally, lowering his hand. "A cut left untreated can turn worse than it looks." "Yes, Your Majesty. Thank you." He turned to leave, and Alira exhaled a breath she had not realized she was holding, relief flooding through her so fast it made her knees weak. But he paused before he had taken more than a few steps, glancing back at her over his shoulder, with an expression that made her stomach twist all over again. "Elira Voss," he said, as though committing it permanently to memory. "I will remember that name." Then he was gone, disappearing around the corner with the same silent, controlled grace with which he had appeared, leaving Alira alone in the hallway with broken pottery in her apron, and a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with fear at all. She did not go to the healer. She told herself there was no time, that the cut was too small to matter, that she needed to clean the mess and return to her duties before Marta noticed her absence. But the truth, though she did not admit it to herself that night, was that she was afraid of what the healer might ask, and more afraid still of what she might accidentally reveal. That night, lying on her narrow cot in the servants' quarters she shared with 3 other girls, Alira stared up at the cracked ceiling and turned the events of the evening over and over in her mind. A stranger had grabbed her, asking about a seal she knew nothing about, and the Alpha King, a man whose name alone made grown warriors lower their eyes, had looked at her as though she were something worth remembering. She did not know which fact frightened her more. Sleep came slowly, and when it finally did, it was filled with gray eyes and the shape of a hand that had almost, but not quite, reached out to touch her. The next morning, Alira woke before dawn, as she always did, and made her way to the kitchens with her mind still tangled in the memory of the hallway. Marta was already awake, barking orders at the younger servants, and for a moment, the familiar chaos of the morning routine helped Alira push the previous night's fear into the back of her thoughts. But the peace did not last. By mid-morning, word had spread through the palace that a personal attendant position had suddenly opened in the king's private wing, and that the head steward was searching the household staff for a replacement. Alira thought nothing of it at first. Such things happened occasionally, and she had never once been considered for positions above her station. She continued scrubbing pots, grateful for the mindless repetition of the work, when Marta appeared at her side with an expression Alira had never seen on the older woman's face before. "You," Marta said, pointing a wooden spoon at her like an accusation. "The steward wants to see you. Now." Alira's hands went still in the soapy water. "Me? Why would the steward want to see me?" "How should I know?" Marta's voice was sharp with irritation, though beneath it, Alira thought she detected something closer to concern. "Just go. Do not keep him waiting. And for the love of the old gods, wash your hands first." Alira dried her hands on her apron, her heart beginning to pound in a rhythm that was becoming uncomfortably familiar, and made her way through the winding palace corridors toward the steward's office, wondering with growing dread whether this had anything to do with the man who had grabbed her the night before, or with the king who had looked at her as though he intended to remember her name for a very long time. She had no way of knowing, as she walked, that her quiet, invisible life was about to end completely, and that nothing waiting for her behind that office door would ever let her return to the safety of being unseen again. The steward's office was small and cluttered with ledgers, the walls lined with shelves that held years of palace records. When Alira stepped inside, the steward, a thin, gray-haired man named Alden, looked up from his desk with an expression she could not quite read. "Alira Voss," he said, and something about the way he said her name, echoing the king's own words from the night before, sent a chill down her spine. "Sit down." She sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, waiting for whatever was about to come. "There has been a change," Alden said, shuffling through the papers on his desk without quite meeting her eyes. "The king has requested a new personal attendant, effective immediately. Someone to manage his private chamber, his meals, his correspondence when needed. It is a position of considerable trust." "I don't understand," Alira said carefully. "Why are you telling me this?" Alden finally looked up, and there was something almost like pity in his gaze. "Because the king specifically requested you." The words hit Alira like a physical blow. For a moment, she simply could not process them, could not fit them into any version of reality that made sense. She was a kitchen servant. She scrubbed pots. She swept floors. She had spent 2 years making herself as small and forgettable as possible, and now the most powerful man in the entire pack had looked at her once, in a dark hallway, with blood on her throat and lies on her lips, and decided that she was the one he wanted at his side. "There must be some mistake," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew there was no mistake at all. "There is no mistake," Alden said. "You are to begin your new duties this evening. I suggest you prepare yourself, Alira. Whatever the king's reasons, this is not an assignment you refuse." Alira left the steward's office in a daze, her mind spinning with questions she could not answer. Why would the king request her, specifically, after a single encounter in a dark hallway? What did he suspect, or know, about the man who had grabbed her the night before? And what would it mean for her, a girl who had spent years trying to disappear, to suddenly find herself standing directly in the light of the palace's most powerful and most feared man? Whatever answers waited for her, she understood one thing, with absolute certainty, as she walked back toward the servants' quarters to gather her few belongings. Her quiet life was over, and there was no version of what came next that would let her return to the safety of the shadows she had called home for so long. Alira arrived at the entrance of the king's private wing that evening carrying a single bag containing everything she owned, and found herself standing before 2 guards who studied her with open suspicion, before allowing her through the heavy oak doors. Inside, the private wing was nothing like the servants' quarters she had known for 2 years. The floors were polished stone instead of rough wood, the walls hung with tapestries depicting the history of the Blackthorn pack, and the air itself seemed to carry the scent of cedar and something else she could not quite name, something that reminded her, strangely, of the man she had met in the hallway the night before. A woman named Greta, who introduced herself as the head of the private wing staff, led Alira through a series of hallways, explaining her new duties in a brisk, businesslike tone that left no room for questions. She would prepare the king's morning and evening meals personally, ensuring they met his exact preferences. She would manage his private chamber, keeping it in order without disturbing his most personal belongings. She would handle certain correspondence when the king's advisors were occupied elsewhere, and she would be available, at all times, should the king require anything at all. "He does not like to be disturbed unnecessarily," Greta said, stopping before a heavy door at the end of the final hallway. "But when he calls for you, you come immediately. Do you understand?"
"Yes,"
Alira said, though privately, she wondered how she was meant to balance being available at all times, with not disturbing him unnecessarily. It seemed like a contradiction designed to keep every attendant permanently anxious. Greta studied her for a long moment, the same way Marta had studied her that morning, as though trying to understand what made this particular servant girl worthy of such an unusual assignment. "You are younger than I expected," she said finally, "and you do not carry yourself like someone who sought this position." "I didn't seek it," Alira admitted. "I don't know why the king chose me." Something flickered across Greta's face, gone before Alira could name it. "Neither do I," she said, "but I suggest you find out quickly, and carefully. The king does not make requests without reason, even when his reasons are not immediately clear to the rest of us." Alira's first evening in her new role passed in a blur of unfamiliar routines and half-formed anxieties. She prepared a simple meal under Greta's watchful supervision, following instructions about the king's preferences that seemed impossibly specific. No spice beyond a certain measure. Meat cooked exactly to a particular texture. Bread served warm but never hot. She carried the tray to his private chamber with hands that trembled slightly, remembering the last time she had walked this same path and found herself pinned against a wall with a blade at her throat. But this time, nothing happened in the hallway. This time, she reached the heavy door of the king's chamber without incident, and when she knocked, a low voice from within told her to enter. Cale Ashgrove sat at a wide desk covered in maps and documents, a single candle casting long shadows across his sharp features. He did not look up immediately when she entered, and Alira used the brief moment to study the room properly for the first time. It was simpler than she expected for a king's private chamber. No excessive luxury, no unnecessary decoration, just books, maps, a modest bed, and the desk where he now sat working through what appeared to be reports from various corners of the Pax territory. "Set it there," he said, gesturing toward a small table near the window without looking up from his papers. Alira did as instructed, setting the tray down carefully, arranging the meal the way Greta had shown her. She was preparing to leave, grateful for the brief and uneventful nature of the interaction, when his voice stopped her at the door. "Sit." She turned, uncertain she had heard him correctly. "Your Majesty?" "Sit," he repeated, finally looking up from his papers, his gray eyes fixing on her with the same unsettling intensity she remembered from the hallway. "I have questions, and I suspect you have answers you did not give me last night." Alira's stomach dropped. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this moment would come eventually. But she had hoped for more time to prepare herself, to construct a story that would satisfy him without revealing more than she wanted to. Now, standing in his private chamber, with nowhere left to retreat, she understood that time had run out. "I don't know what you mean," she said, though the words sounded weak, even to her own ears. "The mark on your throat," Cale said, setting down the paper he had been reviewing, and giving her his full attention. "You told me you fell against a shelf. But a fall against a shelf does not leave a mark that clean, that precise. That is the mark of a blade, Alira Voss, and I want to know who held it against your skin." For a long moment, Alira said nothing, weighing the danger of silence against the danger of truth. She thought of the man's whispered threat, the promise that she would not live to regret telling anyone. But she also thought of the king's gray eyes, steady and unwavering, and something in her gut told her that lying to this man twice would be far more dangerous than telling him the truth once. "There was a man," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "He grabbed me in the hallway before you found me. He asked about a red seal he said you keep in your private chamber. He said if I didn't tell him where it was, he would hurt me. Then he heard footsteps, and he ran." Cale's expression did not change, but something in the air of the room shifted, grew heavier, more charged. He rose from his desk slowly, moving toward the window, his back to her, as he stared out into the darkness beyond the glass. "Did you see his face?" "No, it was too dark, and he kept his hood low. I only heard his voice." "Would you recognize the voice if you heard it again?" Alira considered the question carefully. "Perhaps. I'm not certain." Cale turned back to face her, and for the first time since she had met him, Alira saw something that looked almost like genuine concern cross his features. "The seal he spoke of is real," he said. "It carries information that could be dangerous in the wrong hands. Alliances, weaknesses, secrets that could tear this pack apart if they fell into the wrong claws. Whoever sent that man believed you had access to it because you had recently been assigned to clean this chamber. I never touched anything beyond what I was told to clean," Alira said quickly. "I swear it." "I believe you," Cale said, and something in the certainty of his tone surprised her. "But belief does not protect you from whoever sent him. If they believed you had access once, they may believe it again, especially now that you have been assigned here permanently." Alira felt a fresh wave of fear settle over her, colder and more lasting than the fear she had felt the night before. "Then why did you bring me here? If it puts me in danger, why not simply leave me in the kitchens, where no one would think to look for me?" Cale was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite decipher. "Because in the kitchens, you were an unknown thread that anyone could pull without consequence," he said finally. "Here, under my protection, anyone who wishes to harm you must first face me. That is not a small thing, Alira Voss, whatever you may think of it." The words settled over her strangely, a mixture of relief and unease she did not know how to untangle. She had been pulled into danger and offered protection in the very same breath by the very same man, and she found herself unable to decide whether she should feel grateful or afraid. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked before she could stop herself. "I am only a servant. You could have assigned any number of guards to investigate this seal, this man who threatened me. Why involve yourself so directly?" For a moment, Cale's composure seemed to falter, just slightly, just enough for Alira to notice the crack in the careful control he maintained over every word and expression. "That is a question," he said slowly, "that I am still trying to answer myself." The admission hung in the air between them, unexpected and strangely vulnerable, coming from a man whose reputation suggested he never doubted anything, never hesitated, never admitted uncertainty to anyone. Alira did not know what to say in response, so she said nothing at all, and for a long moment, the two of them simply stood there in the candlelit chamber, the silence stretching between them like something fragile that neither wanted to break. Finally, Cale returned to his desk, the moment passing as quickly as it had arrived. "You will remain in the private wing," he said, his voice returning to its usual controlled tone. "Greta will assign additional guards to watch the corridors near your quarters. You will not go anywhere in this palace alone until we understand who sent that man and why. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "And Alira." He looked up at her one final time before she reached the door. "If anyone approaches you again about the seal, or about anything unusual, you come to me directly. Not Greta, not the guards. Me. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Majesty," she said again, though her heart was pounding for reasons that had less to do with fear, and more to do with the strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest at the intensity in his eyes. She left his chamber that night with more questions than answers, carrying with her the growing awareness that whatever had begun in that dark hallway was far from over, and that the danger surrounding the mysterious red seal was only the first thread in a much larger and more complicated tapestry that was only beginning to unravel around her. Over the following days, Alira settled slowly into her new routine, though settle was perhaps too gentle a word for the constant, low hum of alertness that never quite left her. She prepared the king's meals with careful precision, learning his preferences more intuitively each day. She managed his chamber, dusting his books and organizing his maps without ever touching the documents she now understood contained information dangerous enough to draw a blade against an innocent servant's throat. She saw Cale every morning and every evening, brief interactions that should have felt routine but never quite did. He asked about her day sometimes, questions that seemed almost hesitant coming from a man of his position, as though he was unaccustomed to the simple act of caring how someone else's hours had passed. She found herself answering honestly. more honestly than she had spoken to anyone in years, surprised by how easily the words came when his gray eyes were fixed on her with that same unwavering attention. She told herself it meant nothing. He was simply a careful man, protecting a potential source of danger to his rule, ensuring that a loose thread did not unravel further. She told herself this every night, as she lay on the narrow cot in her new quarters, closer to his chamber than she had ever imagined she would be, and every night, she found the explanation a little harder to believe. 5 days after she had begun her new position, an incident occurred that shattered whatever fragile normalcy had begun to form. Alira was returning from the kitchens with the king's evening meal when she noticed a folded piece of parchment tucked beneath the tray's cloth covering, a note that had not been there when she left the kitchens moments before. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, and the words written in a hurried, unfamiliar hand sent a cold chill through her. "You know more than you claim. Tell the king nothing, or the next blade will not stop at your throat." Alira stood frozen in the hallway, the parchment shaking in her hands, understanding with sudden, terrible clarity that whoever had grabbed her that first night had not given up, and that her new position in the king's private wing had not protected her at all. It had simply made her a more valuable target. Alira's first instinct was to hide the note, to burn it in the nearest candle flame, and pretend she had never seen it at all. But she remembered Cale's words from days before, his insistence that she come to him directly if anyone approached her again, and she understood that hiding this note would only place her in greater danger than revealing it. Her hand still trembled as she carried the tray the rest of the way to his chamber, the folded parchment tucked into her sleeve where it seemed to burn against her skin like a hot coal. When she knocked and entered, Cale looked up from his desk immediately, his sharp eyes catching something in her expression before she had said a single word. "What happened?" "There was a note," she said, pulling the parchment from her sleeve with fingers that would not quite stop shaking. "Hidden beneath the tray. I don't know who left it, or when. I only found it in the hallway." Cale crossed the room in 3 quick strides, taking the parchment from her hands and reading it in silence, his jaw tightening with each word. When he finished, he set it down on his desk with a controlled sort of anger that Alira found more unsettling than if he had shouted. "This changes things," he said. "Whoever is behind this has access to the kitchens, or to someone who works there. They knew exactly when you would be carrying this tray, and they knew exactly how to reach it without being seen. That means someone inside the palace," Alira said slowly, the realization settling over her like a physical weight. "Someone who works here. Someone I might see every single day." "Yes," Cale said, "which means from this moment forward, you trust no one but myself and Greta. Not the guards you do not personally recognize. Not the kitchen staff, however familiar their faces. Do you understand me?" Alira nodded, though the instruction filled her with a fresh kind of loneliness she had not expected. She had spent 2 years surrounded by the same servants, the same familiar routines, and now she was being asked to view every one of them as a potential threat. Cale seemed to notice the shift in her expression, because his voice softened slightly when he spoke again. "I know this is not easy, but until we find who is responsible, caution is the only protection I can offer you." "What will you do?" she asked. "I will increase the guard rotation around the private wing," he said, "and I will begin quietly investigating who among the staff might have reason, or payment, to threaten you on someone else's behalf. This will take time, Alira. I need you to be patient and careful in the meantime." She wanted to ask him more, wanted to understand exactly what the red seal contained that made it worth threatening an innocent servant's life over. But something in his expression told her that this was not information he was prepared to share. Not yet, and perhaps not ever. She swallowed her questions and nodded instead, accepting the uneasy truce between curiosity and survival that seemed to define every interaction she had with this man. Over the following 2 weeks, the palace settled into an uneasy quiet. No further notes appeared. No further threats materialized. Alira began to hope, cautiously, that perhaps the danger had passed, that whoever had threatened her had lost their nerve, or their opportunity, and that her life within the private wing might finally settle into something resembling peace. But peace, she was learning, was a fragile and temporary thing in the world she now occupied. It was during a quiet evening, nearly 3 weeks after she had first been assigned to the private wing, that Alira found herself alone with Cale, in a way that felt different from every interaction that had come before. She had brought his evening meal as usual, expecting the same brief, businesslike exchange, but instead, she found him standing at the window, staring out at the darkening sky, with an expression of exhaustion, so complete it startled her. "Your Majesty?" she said carefully, setting the tray down on the table. "Is something wrong?" He did not answer immediately, and for a moment, Elira wondered if she should simply leave him to his thoughts. But something about the slump of his shoulders, the weight visible in every line of his body, made her hesitate at the door instead of retreating through it. "A neighboring pack has grown restless," he said finally, still facing the window. "They believe our territory holds resources that rightfully belong to them. My advisors want war. They have wanted war for months, convinced that a show of strength will settle the matter before it grows into something worse." "And you don't want war," Elira said, understanding suddenly why he looked so tired, so burdened by something far larger than a single missing seal, or a single anonymous threat. "I don't want unnecessary deaths," he said, turning to face her at last. "But I am one voice among many, and the council grows louder with every season that passes without resolution. Sometimes I wonder if being Alpha King means anything at all, when the weight of every decision rests as much on the fears of others as it does on my own judgment." Elira did not know what compelled her to speak next, whether it was courage or simple honesty born from exhaustion of her own, but the words left her mouth before she could stop them. "I think it means everything," she said. "If it meant nothing, you would simply give the council what they want and sleep easily every night. The fact that it costs you sleep, that it weighs on you this heavily, tells me you are exactly the kind of king this pack needs, even if the council does not see it that way." Kale stared at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his gray eyes that Elira could not name, something that looked almost like surprise, and beneath the surprise, something gentler still. "You speak boldly for a servant," he said, though there was no anger in the observation, only a quiet sort of wonder. "Forgive me," she said quickly, suddenly aware of how far she had overstepped. "I did not mean to speak out of place." "Do not apologize," he said, crossing the room toward her with slow, deliberate steps. "In 3 years as Alpha King, no advisor, no council member, no ally has spoken to me with such simple honesty. Everyone around me measures their words, weighing what I want to hear against what they believe will serve their own interests. You do neither." "I only said what I believe to be true," Elira said, her heart beginning to pound as he stopped only a few feet away from her, closer than he had ever stood before. "That," Kale said quietly, "is precisely why it matters so much." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them named, and Elira found herself unable to look away from his gray eyes, unable to remember why she had ever believed distance and invisibility were the safest way to move through the world. For the first time since she had entered this palace, she felt seen, completely and entirely seen, by a man whose title alone should have made such closeness impossible. The moment broke when a sharp knock sounded at the door, and both of them stepped back instinctively, the spell shattering, as a guard entered with an urgent message about a disturbance near the western gate. Kale's expression shifted immediately back into the controlled, commanding mask Elira had grown used to seeing, and within moments he was gone, leaving her alone in the chamber, with her heart still racing, and her mind spinning with questions she was afraid to answer honestly. She told herself, walking back to her quarters that night, that whatever she had felt in that moment was simply the natural result of exhaustion, and fear, and gratitude for his protection. She told herself this was not something that could ever grow into anything more, not between a servant girl with no lineage and an Alpha King bound by duty to alliances and expectations far beyond her understanding. But lying awake that night, staring at the same cracked ceiling she had stared at every night since arriving in the private wing, Elira found herself thinking not of the mysterious red seal, not of the anonymous threats against her life, but of the way Kale's voice had softened when he told her she spoke with simple honesty, and the way his gray eyes had looked at her, as though she were the only steady thing in a world full of shifting loyalties and looming war. She did not know, as sleep finally claimed her, that the Western Gate disturbance that had called Kale away that night was not a coincidence at all, but the first move in a plot far more dangerous than either of them yet understood, one that would soon force them both to confront exactly how much they had come to mean to each other, and exactly how much they stood to lose. The disturbance at the Western Gate turned out to be far more serious than a simple skirmish. By the time Kale returned to the palace near dawn, word had already spread through the private wing that a small group of armed strangers had attempted to breach the outer wall, only to be driven back by the night guard after a brief and violent confrontation. 2 guards had been injured. One of the intruders had been captured alive, though he refused to speak, even under pressure that Alira did not want to imagine too closely. Greta relayed the news to Alira in hushed, worried tones as they prepared the morning meal together, her hands moving quickly over the ingredients, as though the motion itself might settle her nerves. "This has never happened before," Greta said. "Not in all my years serving this palace. Someone tried to breach the wall itself, not sneak through a servant passage, not bribe a guard, an open attack." "Do they know who sent them?" Alira asked, though a cold, sinking feeling in her stomach told her she already suspected the answer. "Not yet," Greta said, "but the king's advisors believe it is connected to the missing seal, to the same people who have been trying to reach it through other means." Alira's hands went still over the bread she had been slicing. She had not told Greta about the note hidden beneath the tray weeks before, following Kale's instruction to trust no one but him and the older woman herself. But even without knowing the full details, Greta's words confirmed what Alira had feared since the first night in the dark hallway. Whatever information the red seal contained was valuable enough for someone to risk an open attack on the palace itself. When Alira brought the king's morning meal to his chamber, she found him already awake, dressed, and reviewing reports with an intensity that told her he had not slept at all. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and there was a tension in his shoulders that had not been there the night before, when he had stood so close to her that she could still remember the warmth of his presence. "You should rest," she said, before she could stop herself, setting the tray down carefully. "Even a king needs sleep." "There is no time for rest," he said, not looking up from the report in his hands. "The man we captured last night finally spoke, just before dawn. He confirmed what we suspected. This attack, and the earlier threats against you, are connected to a faction within the neighboring pack that seeks to destabilize our territory before any formal declaration of conflict." "Why would they target me?" Alira asked, the question that had haunted her since the very first night finally spilling out. "I am nothing to them. I have no connection to any alliance, any seal, any secret worth this much danger." Kale finally looked up, and something in his expression made Alira's chest tighten with dread. "Because you were seen with me," he said quietly. "The very first night, in that hallway. Someone reported it back to their faction, and they believed, incorrectly, that I had already begun sharing sensitive information with you. They targeted you not because of anything you know, Alira, but because of what they assumed you might become to me." The weight of his words settled over her slowly, each piece falling into place with terrible clarity. She had been threatened, followed, marked as a target, not because of any secret she carried, but because a stranger had glimpsed something between her and the Alpha King in a dark hallway, something that had not even fully existed yet at the time, and had decided it was dangerous enough to warrant violence. "This is my fault," Kale said, his voice low with something that sounded almost like guilt. "If I had not stopped to speak with you that night, if I had simply walked past as any other king would have, you would never have been noticed at all." "You don't know that," Alira said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "And even if it were true, I would rather have been noticed and protected than invisible and vulnerable. I have spent my whole life trying to disappear, Your Majesty. I am tired of it." Kale studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his gray eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its formal distance. "You do not have to call me that when we are alone," he said quietly. "Not anymore. Not after everything we have shared these past weeks." "What should I call you then?" Alira asked, her heart beginning to race, in a way that had nothing to do with the danger surrounding them. "Kale," he said simply. "Just Kale." The name felt strange and intimate on her tongue when she repeated it back to him, a small word that carried far more weight than its size suggested. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet stretching between them charged with something neither was yet ready to name aloud, something that had been building slowly since that very first night in the dark hallway, growing with every shared meal, every honest conversation, every moment of vulnerability that neither of them had intended to reveal. The moment was broken, as it so often was, by the arrival of an advisor with urgent news, and Alira found herself once again stepping back into the shadows of formality. watching as Kale transformed instantly back into the composed, commanding alpha king the pack needed him to be. But something had shifted between them. Something that could not be unshifted, and as she left his chamber that morning, Illyra understood with growing certainty that whatever danger surrounded her, whatever threats waited in the shadows of the palace, the greater danger now was the one growing quietly in her own heart. Over the following days, the palace grew tense with preparation. Additional guards were stationed throughout the private wing. Meetings between Kale and his council grew longer and more frequent, the raised voices sometimes audible even through the thick chamber doors. Illyra caught glimpses of maps spread across tables, markers indicating troop positions and territory boundaries, and she understood that the possibility of war, which Kale had spoken of with such weary reluctance weeks before, was drawing steadily closer. She also noticed, with growing unease, the way certain advisors looked at her when she passed through the halls, their expressions carrying a mixture of curiosity and something closer to suspicion. Word had clearly spread of the king's unusual attention toward his new attendant, and Illyra understood that whatever privacy had existed around her growing closeness with Kale was rapidly disappearing, replaced by the watchful eyes of a court that had very particular expectations about who belonged at an alpha king's side. One evening, as she made her way back from the kitchens, a woman Illyra did not recognize stepped directly into her path, blocking the narrow hallway with deliberate purpose. She was dressed in fine clothing far beyond what any servant would wear, her dark hair pulled back in an elegant style that spoke of noble birth, and her eyes, when they settled on Illyra, carried a coldness that made the hair on the back of Illyra's neck stand on end. "You must be the king's new attendant," the woman said, her tone pleasant on the surface, but carrying an unmistakable edge beneath it. "I have heard a great deal about you." "I don't believe we've met," Illyra said carefully, uncertain of the woman's identity, but instinctively wary of the calculated interest in her expression. "Lady Verena," the woman said, extending a hand that Illyra did not know whether to take. "Daughter of the Alpha of the Thornwood Pack. Perhaps you have heard of the alliance being discussed between our territories." Illyra's stomach dropped. She had heard whispers among the staff of a potential marriage alliance meant to secure peace between packs, whispers she had dismissed as court gossip, unrelated to anything in her own life. Standing before Lady Verena's cool, assessing gaze, she understood suddenly and completely that the whispers were true, and that this woman before her was very likely the intended bride of the Alpha King she had begun, foolishly, to care for. "I have heard mentions," Illyra said carefully, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the sudden ache spreading through her chest. "Then you understand," Lady Verena said, her smile never faltering, even as her words carried unmistakable warning, "that whatever fascination the king has developed for his new attendant is temporary, and ultimately irrelevant to the future of this pack. I would hate for you to grow confused about your place here, or to forget it." Before Illyra could respond, Lady Verena swept past her down the hallway, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive perfume and the cold, sinking certainty that whatever fragile connection had begun to grow between herself and Kale was about to be tested by forces far beyond her control. That night, Illyra lay awake long after the palace had gone quiet, turning Lady Verena's words over in her mind, trying to convince herself that the ache in her chest was simply exhaustion, simply the natural weight of fear and uncertainty that had followed her since that very first night in the dark hallway. But somewhere beneath the exhaustion, she recognized a different feeling entirely, one she had never allowed herself to feel before, and one that terrified her far more than any blade or anonymous threat ever could. She was falling for a king who was promised, by duty and politics, to someone else entirely, and there was no version of that truth that did not end in heartbreak for a servant girl who had never been meant to matter at all. The days following Illyra's encounter with Lady Verena passed in a strange, uneasy blur. She threw herself into her duties with renewed focus, telling herself that if she simply worked hard enough, kept herself busy enough, she could bury the ache that Lady Verena's words had planted in her chest. But no amount of scrubbing or organizing or careful meal preparation could quiet the quiet dread that had settled over her, the certainty that whatever she felt for Kale was a fragile, temporary thing, destined to be crushed beneath the weight of politics and alliances far larger than either of them. She noticed Kale watching her more closely during their brief interactions, as though he sensed the shift in her mood even without understanding its cause. He did not ask directly, and she did not offer an explanation, but the unspoken tension between them grew heavier with each passing day, until it felt like a physical presence in every room they shared. It was nearly a week after her encounter with Lady Verena that Alira finally understood the full scope of what was happening within the palace walls. She had been sent to deliver documents to the council chamber, a rare errand outside her usual duties, and as she approached the heavy doors, she overheard voices raised in heated discussion, voices she recognized as belonging to Cale and several of his senior advisors. "The alliance with Thornwood is not optional," one advisor was saying, his voice sharp with frustration. "Their forces alone could tip the balance against us if war comes. And it is coming, Your Majesty, whether we wish it or not. Lady Verena's hand secures that alliance. Nothing else will. There must be other paths to the same security," Cale's voice responded, controlled, but carrying an edge Alira had not heard from him before. "There are no other paths," another voice cut in, older and colder than the first. "And frankly, Your Majesty, your recent behavior toward a common servant has already raised concerns among our allies. If word reaches Thornwood that their future alpha's mate has been distracted by a kitchen girl, the alliance itself could collapse before it is even formalized." Alira felt her blood run cold, standing frozen just outside the chamber doors, the documents clutched tightly in her hands. She had known, in some distant, abstract way, that her closeness with Cale carried risks, but hearing it discussed so plainly, so coldly, by men who held real power over the fate of the pack, made the danger suddenly, terribly concrete. "Alira Voss has nothing to do with matters of state," Cale said, and something in his tone, some fierce protectiveness Alira had not expected, made her chest ache with a feeling she could not name. "Perhaps not yet," the older advisor replied. "But perception matters as much as truth in matters of alliance, Your Majesty. I would advise you to consider very carefully how much attention you continue to give her, before that perception becomes impossible to correct." Alira did not wait to hear more. She turned and walked quickly back the way she had come, her heart pounding, the documents she had been sent to deliver forgotten in her hands. She found an empty alcove near the servants' stairs and pressed her back against the cool stone wall, trying to steady her breathing, trying to make sense of the conversation she had just overheard. She had known, of course, that a servant and a king could never truly belong together, not in the eyes of the court, not in the eyes of a pack bound by centuries of tradition and political necessity. But knowing it in the abstract and hearing it discussed as an active threat to the kingdom's stability were two very different things, and the second left her feeling smaller and more frightened than she had felt even in the darkest moments of her first night in that hallway. She did not deliver the documents that day. Instead, she returned them quietly to the clerk who had given them to her, claiming a minor illness, and retreated to her quarters, where she allowed herself, for the first time since arriving in the private wing, to simply sit with the full weight of her fear and let it wash over her without trying to push it away. That evening, when she brought Cale his meal, she found herself unable to meet his eyes the way she usually did, unable to offer the easy, honest conversation that had grown between them over the past weeks. Cale noticed immediately, of course, because he noticed everything, and he set down the report he had been reading the moment she entered the room. "Something is wrong," he said, not as a question, but as a simple statement of fact. "You have not looked at me properly since you walked through that door." "I am simply tired," Alira said, setting the tray down and turning to leave, desperate to avoid the conversation she knew was coming. "Alira!" His voice stopped her before she reached the door, quiet, but carrying an authority that she could not ignore. "Please, tell me what has happened." She turned back slowly, and something in his expression, the genuine concern written plainly across his features, broke through the careful composure she had been trying to maintain all day. "I heard your advisors," she said finally, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "In the council chamber, discussing the alliance with Thornwood, discussing Lady Verena, discussing me, and how my presence here threatens everything you are trying to protect." Cale's expression darkened, though not with anger directed at her. "What exactly did you hear?" "Enough to understand my place in all of this," Alira said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. "Enough to understand that whatever this is, between us, cannot continue without consequences that fall far beyond just the two of us. You have a pact to protect, Cale, a kingdom that depends on an alliance I cannot offer you. I understand that. I have always understood that. I simply allowed myself to forget it these past weeks. Cale crossed the room toward her, and this time, he did not stop at a careful distance. He closed the space between them entirely, close enough that Elira could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his gaze. "Do you believe," he said quietly, "that I have not considered every one of those consequences myself? Every single day since that first night in the hallway, I have weighed what I owe to this pack against what I have begun to feel for you, and I will not pretend to you that the answer is simple, or that it comes without cost." "Then why continue?" Elira asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why not simply distance yourself, protect the alliance, protect your pack, and let me return to being invisible, the way I was always meant to be? Because I have tried," Cale said, and the raw honesty in his voice made Elira's breath catch in her throat. "I have told myself, more nights than I can count, that this must end before it grows into something neither of us can walk away from, and every single time, I find myself standing at that door, waiting for you to bring my evening meal, unable to make myself believe that distance is truly what I want." The confession hung between them, heavy and undeniable, and Elira felt something inside her chest crack open, a fragile hope she had been trying desperately to suppress, finally breaking free despite every warning she had given herself. "This will not end well," she said softly. "Not for either of us." "Perhaps not," Cale agreed. "But I would rather face whatever consequences come from being honest about what I feel, than spend the rest of my life wondering what I sacrificed out of fear." Neither of them moved for a long moment, the space between them charged with everything they had both been trying to deny, and when Cale finally reached out and gently took her hand in his, Elira did not pull away. The touch was simple, careful, nothing more than fingers intertwined, but it carried a weight that neither of them could ignore. A quiet acknowledgement of everything that had grown between them since that first terrifying night in the dark hallway. "I need time," Cale said finally, his voice low. "Time to find another path through this alliance, another way to secure peace with Thornwood, that does not require sacrificing everything I have begun to feel for you. I cannot promise you it will be easy, or even that it will succeed. But I am asking you to trust me, Elira, the same way you trusted me the night I found you bleeding in that hallway." "I trust you," Elira said, and she meant it completely, despite every fear still swirling in her chest. "But Cale, please understand, whatever path you find, it must be one that does not put your pack in danger. I could not bear to be the reason war comes to your people." "It will not come to that," Cale said, though something in his eyes suggested even he was not entirely certain of the promise he was making. "I swear it to you." Elira wanted desperately to believe him, and in that moment, standing so close to him with her hand held gently in his, she allowed herself to believe it completely, pushing aside the cold, logical part of her mind that understood exactly how fragile such promises could be in a world ruled by alliances, politics, and the constant looming threat of war. She did not yet know that Lady Verena, humiliated by the king's continued attention toward a servant girl and desperate to secure the alliance her own pack depended upon, had already begun setting a plan into motion that would soon force all of them into a confrontation far more dangerous than anything Elira had faced in that dark hallway weeks before. Lady Verena did not return to the palace after her brief, pointed encounter with Elira in the hallway. Instead, she retreated to the guest quarters reserved for visiting nobility, and for several days, the palace fell into an uneasy quiet, as though everyone within its walls understood that a storm was gathering just beyond the horizon, even if no one could yet see its precise shape. Elira tried to focus on her duties, tried to hold on to the fragile hope that Cale's promise had given her, but the weight of Lady Verena's warning never fully left her thoughts. She found herself glancing over her shoulder more often than usual, studying the faces of every servant and guard she passed, wondering which of them might report her every movement back to a woman, determined to protect her claim on the Alpha King's hand. It was Greta who first brought her the news that shifted everything. "There is to be a formal gathering," Greta said one morning, her voice carefully neutral, as she helped Elira prepare the morning trays. "In 3 days' time. The King's Council has arranged it to formally announce progress on the Thornwood Alliance." Elira's hands stilled over the bread she had been slicing. "What kind of progress?" Greta hesitated, and something in her expression told Elira that whatever news she carried was not going to be easy to hear. "I do not know the details," she said finally. "Only that Lady Verena has requested the gathering personally, and that the council has agreed to grant it. Whatever she intends to announce, Elira, I suspect it concerns you as much as it concerns the alliance itself." Elira spent the following 3 days in a state of quiet, gnawing anxiety, watching Cale grow increasingly distracted and burdened by private meetings with his advisors, meetings he did not invite her to and did not discuss with her afterward. She understood, without needing to be told, that he was fighting for something on her behalf, searching desperately for whatever alternative path he had promised her existed, and the strain of that search was etched clearly into the tired lines of his face each evening when she brought his meal. On the morning of the formal gathering, Elira was informed by Greta that she would be required to attend, standing among the palace staff along the edges of the great hall, present but silent, a formality expected of senior household attendants during significant political announcements. Elira dressed in the simple but formal attire Greta provided, her stomach twisting with a dread she could not shake, and made her way to the great hall alongside the other senior servants. The hall itself was more magnificent than anywhere Elira had ever stood within the palace, its high ceilings supported by carved stone pillars, banners bearing the crest of the Blackthorn pack hanging from every wall. Nobles and advisors filled the space, murmuring among themselves, and at the front of the room, seated upon a raised dais, Cale sat in formal robes that made him look every bit the alpha king his people needed him to be, distant and composed, in a way that made Elira's chest ache, with the memory of how differently he had looked at her, only nights before. Lady Verena arrived last, sweeping into the hall in an elaborate gown of deep crimson, her father, the Alpha of Thornwood, walking beside her with the confident bearing of a man who believed the outcome of this gathering had already been decided in his favor. Elira watched from her place along the wall, her heart pounding, as Lady Verena approached the dais and turned to address the assembled court. "Esteemed members of the Blackthorn court," Lady Verena began, her voice carrying easily through the hall, "my father and I have come today to formalize an alliance that will secure peace and prosperity between our two packs, for generations to come." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, and Elira felt her stomach twist tighter, certain that whatever came next would confirm everything Lady Verena had warned her about days before. But Lady Verena's next words caught the entire hall by surprise, Elira included. However, Lady Verena continued, her gaze sweeping deliberately across the room until it landed, unmistakably, on Elira standing among the servants. "It has come to my attention that our esteemed Alpha King's attention has been divided of late, in ways that concern the stability of this proposed alliance." A tense silence fell over the hall, and Elira felt every eye in the room slowly turning toward her, understanding with sick certainty exactly what was about to happen. Lady Verena had not come to formalize the alliance at all. She had come to publicly expose Cale's connection to a servant girl, to force his hand in front of the entire court, where he would have no choice but to deny it, to protect the alliance his kingdom desperately needed. "Lady Verena," Cale's voice cut through the silence, calm, but carrying a warning edge, "I would advise you to choose your next words very carefully." "I mean no disrespect, Your Majesty," Lady Verena said, though her tone carried nothing but calculated challenge. "I simply believe this court deserves honesty before any formal alliance is sealed. Tell me, Your Majesty, is it true that your personal attendant, a servant girl of no lineage, has become the object of your private affection?" Elira's heart stopped. Every face in the hall turned toward her now, curious and calculating, and she felt herself shrinking beneath the weight of their collective attention. Every instinct she had spent years cultivating screaming at her to disappear, to become invisible once again. But there was nowhere to hide, not in this hall, not beneath the gaze of an entire court waiting to see how their king would answer. Cale rose slowly from his seat upon the dais, and when he spoke, his voice carried through the hall with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "You ask a question you already believe you know the answer to, Lady Verena. I will not insult this court by denying what many of you have likely already suspected. Yes, Elira Voss has become someone I value, someone whose honesty and courage I have come to respect deeply during the time she has served in my private wing." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Elira felt her face flush hot with a mixture of shock and fear, uncertain whether Cale's honesty had just saved her or condemned her entirely. However, Kale continued, his gaze sweeping the hall with the same commanding authority Alira had witnessed in their private conversations. I fail to see how my personal regard for a member of my household staff should be presented before this court as a matter requiring public judgment. Lady Verena, if you have concerns regarding the alliance between our packs, I would welcome discussing them privately, as matters of state deserve. What you have chosen to do instead is transform a private matter into public spectacle, and I would ask you to consider what that reveals about your own intentions here today. Lady Verena's composed expression cracked, just slightly, color rising in her cheeks, as the room's attention shifted subtly from Alira toward the calculated nature of her own accusation. I only sought honesty, Your Majesty, she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Then you have received it, Kale said, and I trust this court can now proceed with discussing the genuine matters of alliance and security that brought us here today, rather than the private affairs of my household. The gathering continued for another hour, though Alira absorbed almost none of the political discussion that followed, her mind still reeling from the public exposure she had just endured, and from the fact that Kale had chosen, in front of his entire court, to acknowledge his feelings for her, rather than deny them for the sake of political convenience. When the gathering finally ended and the nobles began filing out of the great hall, Alira slipped away quickly, desperate for the privacy of her own quarters where she could finally process everything that had just happened. She did not make it far before a hand caught her arm gently, and she turned to find Kale standing behind her, having clearly abandoned whatever formal departure protocol his position usually required in order to follow her. "Are you well?" he asked, his eyes searching her face with genuine concern. "I don't know," Alira admitted honestly. "I have never been so exposed before, in front of so many people. I don't know what happens now, Kale. What this means for you, for the Alliance, for everything you have been trying to protect." "What it means," Kale said quietly, "is that I am done pretending this is something small enough to hide. Lady Verena forced my hand today, and though I did not choose the timing, I find I do not regret the honesty that came from it." "But the Alliance," Alira pressed. "Your counsel, the threat of war with Thornwood, all of it still exists. I have not solved any of that, simply by being acknowledged in front of a room full of nobles." "No," Kale agreed. "But it is a beginning, Alira. And sometimes a beginning is worth more than a carefully maintained silence that protects nothing but everyone's comfortable assumptions." Alira wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this public acknowledgement would somehow lead to a resolution rather than disaster. But as she watched Lady Verena and her father exit the great hall with expressions of cold, calculated fury, she understood that whatever peace Kale's honesty had won them today, it had also transformed Lady Verena from a mere political rival into something far more dangerous, an enemy with wounded pride, and every reason in the world to ensure that Alira paid a price for the humiliation she had just witnessed. In the days following the formal gathering, the palace buzzed with quiet gossip, servants and nobles alike whispering about the king's public acknowledgement of his feelings for a common attendant. Alira felt the weight of every glance now, some curious, some disapproving, a few even sympathetic, but all of them a reminder that her private world had become very publicly entangled with the fate of the entire kingdom. Lady Verena and her father departed the palace the day after the gathering, offering no further comment on the alliance, leaving behind an uncertainty that settled over the court like a heavy fog. Kale's advisors grew increasingly anxious, pressing him daily for reassurance that the Thornwood alliance had not been irreparably damaged, and Alira watched him grow more exhausted with each passing meeting, the weight of the kingdom's uncertain future pressing down on him in ways she felt powerless to ease. It was nearly a week after the gathering when the first sign of real danger appeared. Alira had been sent to the eastern gardens to gather herbs for the evening meal, a task she had performed many times before without incident, always accompanied by one of the guards assigned to watch over her since the earlier threats. But on this particular afternoon, the guard who normally walked with her had been reassigned unexpectedly to help address a disturbance elsewhere in the palace grounds, leaving Alira alone among the garden's tall hedges for the first time in weeks. She noticed the danger too late. A figure emerged from behind a thick row of hedges, moving with the same silent, deliberate purpose she remembered from that very first night in the dark hallway, and before Alira could call out or run, a hand clamped firmly over her mouth, pulling her backward into the shadows of the garden wall. You should have listened the first time, a voice hissed against her ear, low and cold, and Alira's blood turned to ice as she recognized something familiar in its tone, though she could not immediately place where she had heard it before. The king grows careless, and you grow more dangerous, with every day you remain at his side. Alira struggled against the grip holding her heart pounding wildly, but the hand over her mouth only tightened, and she felt the cold press of a blade against her ribs, a silent, unmistakable threat. I have done nothing, she managed to gasp out, as the hand loosened just slightly. I know nothing about your seal, nothing about your plans. Please, just let me go. It is too late for that, the voice said. You have made yourself a target simply by existing at his side, and my employer has grown tired of waiting for you to disappear on your own. Before Alira could respond, a sharp cry echoed from somewhere near the garden entrance, and the grip on her suddenly loosened as her attacker turned toward the sound, distracted. Alira did not hesitate. She twisted free, stumbling forward, and screaming as loudly as her lungs would allow, the sound tearing through the quiet garden and echoing off the stone walls of the palace. Guards arrived within moments, drawn by her scream, and Alira watched through tear-blurred vision as her attacker fled deeper into the garden's maze of hedges, disappearing before the guards could catch more than a fleeting glimpse of his retreating shadow. She sank to her knees on the garden path, her whole body trembling violently, and it was only when Kale himself burst through the garden entrance, his expression a mixture of fury and terror that she had never seen on him before, that she finally allowed herself to break down completely. He was at her side in an instant, kneeling down and pulling her carefully into his arms, his hands checking over her for injuries, with a desperate thoroughness that spoke of fear far deeper than simple political concern. Are you hurt? He demanded, his voice rough with an emotion he made no effort to hide. Alira, look at me. Are you hurt? I'm fine, she managed to say between shaking breaths. He didn't cut me. He just wanted to frighten me, to warn me. Warn you of what? Kale's voice carried a barely controlled fury now, directed not at her, but at whoever had dared to threaten her within his own palace grounds. That I have made myself a target, Alira said quietly, simply by remaining at your side. Kale's arms tightened around her, and for a long moment, he said nothing at all, simply holding her against his chest, as her trembling slowly began to subside. When he finally spoke, his voice had steadied, though the fury beneath it remained clear. This ends now, he said. I will not allow you to live in fear within my own walls, Alira. Whoever is responsible for this will be found, and they will answer for every threat they have made against you. He carried her back to the palace himself, refusing to let anyone else near her until she had been examined by the palace healer and confirmed to be physically unharmed, though the fear in her eyes remained long after the healer had finished her examination. That evening, Kale called an emergency council meeting, and though Alira was not permitted to attend, Greta later told her that the king had demanded, in no uncertain terms, that every available resource be dedicated to identifying who had orchestrated the attacks against her. It was during the investigation that followed, over the course of the next several days, that a name finally emerged, one that sent a fresh wave of shock through the palace. A guard captain named Edric, a man who had served the palace faithfully for over a decade, was discovered to have been secretly accepting payment from an agent connected to Lady Verina's household, payment intended to destabilize Kale's position through any means necessary, including the theft of the sensitive red seal and the elimination of any potential threat to the Thornwood Alliance, a category that had come to include Alira herself once her connection to the king became public knowledge. Edric was arrested quietly, without the public spectacle that had accompanied Lady Verina's earlier confrontation, but the revelation of his betrayal sent ripples of unease through the entire palace staff, everyone left wondering how many other trusted faces might harbor similarly hidden loyalties. Kale came to Alira's quarters himself the evening the truth was confirmed, his expression grim, but carrying a note of relief that had been absent from his features for weeks. It is done, he said, sitting beside her on the narrow bed that had become her refuge over the past difficult days. Edric has confessed everything. The threats against you, the missing seal, all of it traces back to an attempt by certain factions within Thornwood to weaken this pack, before any formal alliance could be secured, using you as a means of destabilizing my judgment and my standing among my own council. Then it's over, Alira said, relief flooding through her chest, for the first time in what felt like ages. The immediate danger, yes, Cale said carefully. But Alira, this revelation changes everything regarding the Thornwood alliance itself. If members of their own household orchestrated this scheme, my council will rightfully question whether any alliance with them can be trusted at all. We stand now at the edge of exactly the conflict I have spent months trying to avoid. Alira felt her relief curdle into fresh anxiety. So this is still my fault, she said quietly. Whatever happens next, war or peace, it still traces back to me. No, Cale said firmly, taking her hands in his, with a gentleness that contradicted the intensity in his eyes. This traces back to a faction within Thornwood that was willing to threaten an innocent woman's life to protect their own political interests. You did nothing, Alira, but exist honestly in a world that has tried, over and over, to punish you for it. Whatever comes next, the responsibility lies with those who chose violence over honesty, not with you. His words offered some comfort, but as Alira lay awake that night, she could not shake the growing certainty that the danger surrounding her had not ended with Edric's confession. It had simply revealed how deep the roots of this conspiracy truly ran, and how much further they might yet need to dig before the threat against them both was finally, completely uprooted. The weeks following Edric's confession brought a strange, uneasy calm to the palace, the kind that Alira had come to distrust deeply after everything she had endured. Cale's council remained divided over how to respond to the revelation of Thornwood's betrayal, some advisors demanding immediate retaliation, others urging caution until the full scope of the conspiracy could be understood. Cale himself walked a careful line between the two positions, determined to protect his pack without dragging it into a war built on the schemes of a single treacherous faction, rather than the will of an entire people. Alira, meanwhile, found herself slowly emerging from the fear that had gripped her since that first night in the dark hallway. With Edric removed, and additional guards stationed permanently throughout the private wing, she began to feel something she had not felt in months, a fragile, cautious sense of safety that allowed her to breathe more easily with each passing day. It was during this uneasy calm that her relationship with Cale deepened in ways neither of them had anticipated. Freed from the immediate weight of danger, they found themselves sharing quiet evenings together that had nothing to do with duty or investigation. Simply two people, slowly discovering how much they had come to matter to each other. Cale told her stories of his childhood, of the pressures of being raised to inherit a throne he had never asked for, of the loneliness that came with a position where everyone around him wanted something, and few offered anything in return. Alira, in turn, shared pieces of her own history she had never spoken of to anyone within the palace walls. Her father's failed business, her mother's quiet grief over the family's fall, from modest comfort into debt, the years of careful invisibility she had cultivated as a survival strategy, never imagining that a single night in a dark hallway would unravel it so completely. I used to believe being unseen was the safest thing a person could be, she told him one evening, as they sat together near the window of his chamber, watching the last light of sunset fade over the palace grounds. Now I wonder if I simply spent years hiding from a life I was afraid to want. And now? Cale asked, his hand finding hers in the gathering dusk. Now I am terrified, every single day, Alira admitted with a small, rueful smile. But it is a different kind of fear than before. Not the fear of disappearing, but the fear of losing something I have finally allowed myself to want. Cale lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles that sent warmth spreading through her entire chest. I understand that fear, he said quietly. Every day, I weigh what I want against what duty demands of me, and every day, I find myself less willing to sacrifice one for the other. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed by the palace staff, though the earlier scandal surrounding Lady Verina's public confrontation had somewhat softened into quiet acceptance among many who worked within the private wing. Greta, in particular, seemed to have shifted from cautious neutrality to something closer to quiet support, often finding small ways to give Alira and Cale a few private moments amid the demands of palace life. But not everyone within the court had softened toward the growing relationship between the Alpha King and his former kitchen servant. Whispers persisted among certain nobles that Alira was unworthy of such attention, that her lack of lineage made her fundamentally unsuited to stand beside a king, regardless of whatever honesty and courage she had demonstrated. Alira learned to endure these whispers with a quiet dignity she had not known she possessed, drawing strength from Kale's steady support, and from her own growing confidence in exactly who she was and what she deserved. It was nearly a month after Edric's arrest that new information emerged, information that would once again threaten the fragile peace Illyra and Kale had begun to build together. A messenger arrived from a distant outpost near the border with Thornwood territory, carrying urgent news that sent Kale's council into immediate, anxious deliberation. Thornwood forces had begun mobilizing along the border, a clear sign that despite the quiet aftermath of Lady Verina's humiliation and Edric's exposed betrayal, the faction responsible for the earlier conspiracy had not abandoned their goals. If anything, the failure of their scheme to destabilize Kale through Illyra had only pushed them toward more direct and dangerous action. Kale called Illyra to his chamber the evening the news arrived, his expression grave in a way that immediately filled her with dread. "Thornwood forces are gathering," he told her without preamble, understanding that she deserved honesty above careful diplomatic phrasing. "My council believes conflict is now unavoidable, and for the first time, I fear they may be right." "What does this mean?" Illyra asked, though she already suspected the answer would not bring her comfort. "It means I must ride to the border myself," Kale said, "to assess the situation directly and determine whether there remains any path to peace before the first blow is struck. I cannot send advisors in my place for a matter of this magnitude. My pack needs to see their king standing at the front of this crisis, not hiding safely within these walls while others risk their lives on his behalf." Illyra's chest tightened with a fear entirely separate from anything she had experienced during the earlier threats against her own life. "When do you leave?" "Tomorrow morning," Kale said. "I do not know how long I will be gone, Illyra, or what I will find when I arrive. I only know that I cannot in good conscience remain here while my people face the possibility of war without their king present to lead them." "Then I understand," Illyra said, though every part of her wanted desperately to beg him to stay, to find some other way to resolve this crisis that did not require him to ride directly toward danger. "But please, Kale, promise me you will be careful. Whatever this conflict demands of you, promise me you will not throw away your own safety carelessly." Kale pulled her into his arms, holding her close in a way that spoke of everything neither of them dared to say aloud, the unspoken fear that this parting might be far more permanent than either of them wanted to admit. "I promise you," he said quietly against her hair, "that I will do everything within my power to return to you, Illyra. Whatever else this conflict demands, that is one promise I intend to keep." The following morning, Illyra stood among the gathered crowd at the palace gates, watching as Kale mounted his horse alongside a contingent of his most trusted warriors, preparing to ride toward a border crisis that could determine the fate of the entire pack. Before he departed, he found her eyes one final time across the crowd, and though he said nothing aloud, the look he gave her carried a silent promise that settled deep into her chest, a vow she chose to believe with everything she had left. As his horse disappeared down the winding road leading away from the palace, Illyra felt a fresh wave of fear settle over her, colder and more consuming than anything she had experienced during the earlier threats against her own life. She had survived attacks in dark hallways, threatening notes hidden beneath trays, ambushes in quiet gardens, but nothing had prepared her for the particular terror of watching the man she loved ride directly toward a war that neither of them could be certain he would survive. The days following Kale's departure stretched into an agonizing blur for Illyra, each one heavier than the last as she waited for word from the border, any sign that would tell her whether the crisis had been resolved peacefully or had erupted into the war everyone had feared for months. The palace itself seemed to hold its breath alongside her, servants and nobles alike moving through their duties with a tense, subdued quiet that made the corridors feel colder than usual. Greta did her best to keep Illyra occupied, assigning her additional tasks throughout the private wing, but no amount of work could fully distract her from the constant, gnawing worry that settled over her chest like a physical weight. She found herself standing at the window of her quarters each evening, staring out toward the road that led to the border, as though sheer force of will might conjure Kale's return sooner than fate intended. On the 5th day of his absence, a messenger arrived at the palace gates, and word spread quickly through the household that news had finally come from the border. Illyra rushed to the great hall, alongside dozens of anxious servants and nobles, all of them desperate to learn what had happened, and found the council already gathered, listening intently as the exhausted messenger delivered his report. "The king has secured a temporary truce," the messenger announced, and a wave of relief rippled through the assembled crowd. Thornwood's forces have withdrawn from the border, following negotiations led personally by His Majesty. Formal terms are still being finalized, but for now, the immediate threat of open conflict has been averted. Alira felt her knees weaken with relief, tears springing unbidden to her eyes, as the tension she had carried for 5 agonizing days finally began to loosen its grip on her chest. But her relief was tempered almost immediately by the messenger's next words. The king has also uncovered further information regarding the faction responsible for the earlier conspiracy against the private wing, the messenger continued, his expression growing grave. It appears the scheme extended beyond Lady Verina's immediate household, reaching into elements of Thornwood's own military leadership, individuals who sought to provoke war deliberately in order to seize greater power within their own pack's structure. The revelation sent fresh murmurs through the crowd, and Alira understood, with a sinking feeling, that the danger surrounding her and Kale had never truly been about the missing seal at all, not fundamentally. It had always been about ambitious factions within Thornwood, seeking to exploit any weakness they could find, and Alira herself had simply been the most convenient weakness available to them. "When does the king return?" Alira asked, unable to stop herself despite the many curious eyes that turned toward her at the question. "Within 3 days," the messenger said. "He remains at the border currently, finalizing the truce terms and ensuring the treacherous elements within Thornwood's leadership are properly addressed before he departs." 3 days felt like an eternity, but Alira forced herself to endure the wait with as much patience as she could summon, drawing comfort from the knowledge that Kale was safe, that the immediate threat of war had been averted, and that whatever remained to be resolved could finally be addressed without the constant shadow of violence hanging over every conversation. When Kale finally returned to the palace on the morning of the 3rd day, Alira was waiting at the gates alongside the rest of the household, and the moment his horse came into view along the winding road, she felt every remaining trace of tension dissolve into pure, overwhelming relief. He looked exhausted, his face weathered by days of difficult negotiation and the weight of decisions that had determined the fate of his entire pack, but his eyes found hers across the crowd the moment he dismounted, and the warmth in his gaze told her everything she needed to know. He did not wait for formal protocol. In front of the entire gathered household, nobles and servants alike, Kale crossed the courtyard directly to where Alira stood, pulling her into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could of everything he had carried with him during his days at the border. "You kept your promise," Alira said softly against his chest, her voice thick with emotion. "You came back to me." "I told you I would," Kale said, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. "Though I confess, Alira, there were moments at that border when I feared I might not be able to keep it." That evening, once the formal business of his return had been addressed and his council had finally allowed him a moment of privacy, Kale shared with Alira the full details of what had transpired at the border, details he had not wanted to burden the messenger with sharing publicly. The faction within Thornwood responsible for the conspiracy had been led by a senior military commander who had grown convinced that war with Blackthorn would provide the perfect opportunity to seize greater control within his own pack's leadership structure, using the missing red seal and the manufactured threat against Alira as tools to destabilize both packs simultaneously. He believed that if he could provoke conflict, Kale explained, chaos would allow him to consolidate power within Thornwood, while Blackthorn remained distracted by war. Lady Verina, to her credit, was horrified when the full extent of his scheme became clear. She had genuinely believed the alliance between our packs would secure peace, and she had no knowledge that elements within her own household's military had been working to undermine that very peace from within. "So she wasn't entirely at fault," Alira said slowly, surprised to feel a flicker of something like sympathy for the woman who had once threatened and humiliated her. "No," Kale agreed. "Misguided in her methods, certainly, and unnecessarily cruel toward you, but not the architect of the true danger we faced. That distinction belongs entirely to Commander Aldrich Thornbrook, who has since been removed from his position and is currently facing judgment before Thornwood's own council for his treachery." "Then it's truly over," Alira said, hardly daring to believe the words, even as she spoke them. "The immediate threat, yes," Kale said, taking her hands in his, with a tenderness that had become so familiar over the past months. "But Alira, there remains one matter I have not yet resolved, one that I intend to address very soon. and very publicly. Something in his tone made Elira's heart begin to race, a mixture of hope and uncertainty she could not fully untangle. What matter is that? Cale smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile she had seen from him since his return, and the warmth of it filled her chest with a hope she had barely allowed herself to feel throughout the long, uncertain months since that very first terrifying night in the dark hallway. "Patience," he said softly. "You will understand very soon. I promise you." Elira wanted to press him further, but something in his expression told her that whatever he was planning, it was a surprise he intended to reveal in his own time, and she found herself willing, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply trust in the promise of what waited ahead, rather than fear the uncertainty of not yet knowing. 2 weeks after Cale's return from the border, word spread through the palace that a formal gathering had once again been called within the Great Hall, this time at the king's own request rather than at the demand of any visiting noble. Elira felt a familiar anxiety return as she prepared for the event, memories of Lady Verina's public confrontation still fresh enough to make her stomach twist with worry over what this new gathering might bring. Greta helped her dress that morning, though this time, instead of the simple attire Elira had worn to the previous gathering as a member of the household staff, Greta presented her with a gown of deep blue fabric, finer than anything Elira had ever worn in her life, its careful stitching and delicate embroidery speaking of hours of skilled craftsmanship. "I don't understand," Elira said, staring at the gown with confusion. "This isn't appropriate attire for household staff." "You are not attending as household staff today," Greta said, a knowing smile, tugging at the corners of her lips, that told Elira the older woman knew far more about what was coming than she was willing to reveal. Elira's heart began to race as she made her way toward the Great Hall that morning, dressed in a gown that felt like a costume for a role she was not certain she was ready to play. When she arrived, she found the hall filled to capacity, every noble and advisor of significant standing gathered once again beneath the high stone ceilings, their murmured conversations falling silent as she entered, every eye turning toward her with open curiosity. Cale stood at the front of the hall, dressed in the same formal robes he had worn during the previous gathering, but his expression carried none of the guarded formality from that day. Instead, his gray eyes found hers immediately as she entered, and the warmth in them settled some of the anxious fluttering in her chest, even as her confusion about the purpose of this gathering remained. "Elira Voss," Cale said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Please, come forward." Elira moved through the crowd with legs that felt unsteady beneath her, aware of every gaze following her progress toward the front of the hall, until she stood before Cale upon the raised dais, close enough to see the mixture of nervousness and determination written plainly across his features, an expression she had rarely seen him wear in front of others. "Members of this court," Cale began, turning to address the assembled nobles and advisors, "months ago, in this very hall, I was asked to account publicly for my private affections, and I chose honesty over convenient denial. Today, I stand before you once again, not because anyone has demanded it of me, but because I have made a decision I wish to share with this entire court, openly and without hesitation." He turned back to face Elira, and something in his expression made her breath catch in her throat. Elira Voss came into this palace as a servant, with no lineage, no noble title, nothing beyond her own courage and honesty to recommend her, Cale continued. "In the months since, she has faced threats against her life, public humiliation, and the constant scrutiny of a court, uncertain whether she belonged among us. Through all of it, she has shown a strength and integrity that I have found in no advisor, no ally, no noble born to privilege and title. She has become, quite simply, the person I trust most completely in this world, and I find I am no longer willing to keep that truth hidden behind careful diplomatic silence." Elira felt tears gathering in her eyes, as Cale reached out and took her hands in his, kneeling slowly before her in front of the entire assembled court, a gesture that sent a ripple of astonished murmurs through the crowd. "Elira Voss," he said, his voice steady, despite the enormity of the moment, "I am asking you, before this court, and before the pack I have sworn to protect, to stand beside me, not as my attendant, but as my equal, my mate, and my future queen. I do not offer you this out of impulsive passion, but out of a certainty I have built slowly, through every honest conversation, Every moment of courage I have witnessed in you. Every quiet strength you have shown, even in the darkest circumstances. Will you accept this, Illyra, and stand beside me for whatever futures awaits our pack?" The hall fell utterly silent, every noble and advisor holding their breath as they waited for her answer, and Illyra found herself unable to speak for a long moment, overwhelmed by the weight of everything that had led to this moment, from that first terrifying night in the dark hallway, to this instant of complete, public vulnerability, before the very court that had once doubted her worth so completely. "Yes," she finally managed to say, her voice thick with emotion, but carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Yes, Kale, I will stand beside you, for whatever future comes." The hall erupted into a mixture of applause and astonished murmurs, and Kale rose to his feet, pulling Illyra into an embrace that spoke of everything they had endured together to reach this moment. As the sounds of celebration filled the great hall around them, Illyra allowed herself, finally, to release every fear she had carried since that first night, understanding that whatever challenges still awaited her as the future queen of the Blackthorn pack, she would face them, not as an invisible servant hoping to disappear, but as a woman who had finally claimed her rightful place in the world, standing proudly beside the king, who had seen her worth from the very first moment their paths had crossed in a dark and dangerous hallway. In the months that followed, the formal alliance between Blackthorn and a reformed, more trustworthy leadership within Thornwood was finalized, built not on the fragile foundation of an arranged marriage, but on genuine mutual respect between two packs, who had both suffered from the treachery of ambitious individuals within their ranks. Lady Verena, having distanced herself entirely from the conspiracy that had once threatened Illyra's life, eventually became an unexpected ally, her own experience with betrayal within her household teaching her the value of honesty over calculated political maneuvering. Illyra's transformation from servant to queen was not without its challenges. She spent long hours learning the responsibilities that came with her new position, facing the lingering skepticism of certain nobles who still questioned whether a woman without noble lineage truly belonged at an Alpha King's side. But she met every challenge with the same quiet courage that had first drawn Kale's attention in that dark hallway so many months before, earning respect not through inherited title, but through the strength of her own character. On the day of their formal union, held within the same great hall where Kale had once knelt before her in front of the entire court, Illyra stood beside him as his equal in every sense, no longer the invisible servant girl who had once believed disappearing was the only path to safety. She had learned, through danger and fear and the slow unfolding of genuine love, that being seen, truly seen, by someone who valued her honesty and her courage above every expectation of birth and status, was worth every risk she had faced to reach this moment. As the ceremony concluded and the celebration began, Kale leaned close to whisper words meant only for her, a private acknowledgement of everything they had overcome together. "You were never supposed to become my greatest fascination," he said softly, echoing words that seemed to capture the entire unlikely journey that had brought them to this moment. "And yet here you stand, exactly where you were always meant to be." Illyra smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as the sounds of celebration rose around them, finally at peace with the extraordinary path that had led a quiet, invisible servant girl to become the queen, standing proudly beside the Alpha King she loved.